it rolling?
It's
We're here.
We're here.
All right. Seaholm High School. Just before 8 a.m. on a nice Wednesday morning.
This is the parking lot. Eventually it'll be full.
That's right.
Every one of these spots will have people in it.
And as we pull around here, just a couple weeks ago, there were so many police cars right in that bus loop.
Several Western Washington high schools were closed today, targeted in apparent swatting cases.
Where were you? I was right up in Zentner's room, which is that one right there.
Oh, there it is.
To the right of the staircase.
Yep.
6 schools in total were targeted, including Cedro Woolley High School, Rochester High School, Lincoln High School, Roosevelt High School, Seaholm High School.
I was at the far room at the back, or 2 down. I was in
Leda.
right over there. That was my first time being in a lockdown at one of the windows and then being able to look at it.
These incidents, they are far from harmless, inducing fear and diverting limited resources for a lot of these areas.
It made it worse and it also made it better, knowing that there were more police here, but there were also police here and everything. Like being able to realize what was fully happening.
I know what you're saying. Yep. Yeah. Crazy stuff.
These false reports of school shootings adds a tremendous amount of stress, not only to students, but also to teachers, to staff, to parents.
And I mean, this happened like multiple times in the span of a year too. It's crazy stuff. And Seaholm's been lucky in that, you know, nothing has truly come of it and nobody has died.
And even while researching this project, we found out that someone got shot outside of my cousin's high school in Portland. And that's something that we would have never found if it wasn't for looking at all these tallies and like websites everywhere. It didn't make the national news or even local news. Like Portland isn't even that far away, but it's just been so normalized that it almost gets swept under the rug, which is horrible.
It's insane. The fact is, it happens so frequently around this country that it just doesn't really make the news a lot of the time. It's terrible, and it's obvious that something needs to change. Should we start?
Yeah, I'm good to start.
Number 1?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Do you feel like the severity of the effects of not just the actual instances where there are violence, but the severity of the effects of the threats that occur, do you think the effect of that is kind of communicated well enough across the country when those things make the news? Like, do people realize how big of a deal these threats actually are to the communities that they're made against?
So. I don't know if you guys feel the same way. Like, you know, I was like, how do people not know like how impacted we are?
Exactly.
Like when we had to call and be like, no, really, like this was really traumatizing. They're like, oh yeah, like even though that's like the response, like no one was physically injured, thinking about like how traumatizing it is for kids to experience that and then to do it multiple times and then have it again this year. And I think that we'll never know the full impact on the community, but I think that I don't think that people truly understand how terrifying it is and that it shouldn't be this way, right? Like we shouldn't have to be sitting in a classroom wondering about the safety and what's going to happen. And then we have teachers who are like, okay, I mean, as a community, we're like, okay, let's go to our next class. Right? In most places, you would just be like, okay, let's shut down, pause, and do something else. But we're asking, like, let's just keep moving. And sometimes that feels like jarring. And sometimes it's like, well, what other options do we have?
Right.
And so I think one of the pieces that we've worked on, especially after the walkout, is like how, when we build safety protocols, do we build in what happens after that triggering event happens or the safety concern? That's not actually when the emergency ends.
All right.
Is there anything, I guess, is there just anything else you want to add at all?
And it's okay if not.
No, I mean, I just think that I wish that we could go, I wish that didn't happen, right? Like, I wish that we didn't have to. And I think that especially in the month of December, like, we all kind of, like, I don't know if you've read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, but, like, our body knows that this is the time and we have a response. Mm-hmm. And so it's really just continuing to think through how do we support each other through those things? How do we, when we see something that's a little off, how do we feel empowered to respond? And it will take all of us to keep creating that safe space and having connections and friendships and checking on people who, it's all of those pieces that create that. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so
Do I
much.
get to see the final picture?
Absolutely, yes, you do. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Ms. Cole and the CM staff really are doing an amazing job. As much as these situations are hard and difficult for everybody, it is good to know as students at CHOME that we are in good hands, and the administration is doing everything they can and a great job at it to keep us safe. And on top of that, we wanted to go to another end of what happens during these scenarios of gun violence in our community. And for that, we went over to St. Joe's in the ER at the local hospital.
I'm working on gathering my Zoom capabilities.
Hello.
Real quick.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Oh, no, you're good?
It's all good. We were just looking at the same thing and we're like,
Yeah.
We got to interview two incredible physicians. The first you saw there was Dr. Robert Rush, and the second was Worth Everett. On top of the introductions they're going to give in a second, they're a little too humble to really brag about themselves, so we can do a little bit more for them. Dr. Rush is a general surgeon, the emergency surgery medical director, and also the surgical quality officer at St. Joe's. On top of that, he also does work in simulation and education. Dr. Everett is the former director of the ER at St. Joe's, used to teach emergency medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and has been working in emergency medicine for over 20 years in 7 different ERs. Two very educated people on the topic of gun violence in terms of inside a hospital setting.
we've heard snippets about it, but we kind of want to start from a clean slate. What is the protocol in the emergency department when you get a call about like a shooting threat or shooting at a school or some big gathering? What's the protocol there?
Yeah, so most of the time, most organizations have, so we get notification from somebody outside of the hospital. And so in those situations, if that call comes into the emergency department, we have a head person who answers the phone, a charge nurse. And then that sets up a cascade of events within the hospital.
The people who are at the hospital at the time will mobilize in response to it.
The chief administrators in the hospital get notified. And then we, like I'm the head doctor, I'll get notified that, there may be a mass casualty incident. And here are the details that we know. And usually what that means is that we will clear out the trauma rooms in anticipation of maybe having, multiple people. And then kind of a cascade of events. Every single department in the hospital, in most hospitals, kind of go into ultra conservative mode, meaning they stop everything that they're doing and be ready to send people to help in the emergency department. But again, it's also very organized. If we know we're going to have a mass casualty event, we only have a few doctors working. We will probably pick up the phone and call in. There's probably half a dozen doctors that live within 10 minutes of the hospital, and we'll call them if it's going to be a real thing, saying please come in. Most people will just drop what they're doing and come right in.
The other thing that when we have a response like happened to CHOME, what was it, about a month or so ago, we've learned that the smallest incident or a fake incident even, we're not sure what happened. We get a report, we mobilize and get ready for it. And the thing that we also do is that we treat it like it's real, and then we go back and look, hey, well, we have to stand down, or there's one patient that comes in and not everybody else was fine. So we always go through and go, hey, how did that go? What could we have done better?
I'll give you an example. When I was in Philadelphia when 9/11 started. The planes flew in the buildings, and that was in New York City, and so. But we didn't know that. I mean, all we knew is that there was a mass casualty incident going on there, and it was an attack on America. And so what happened immediately is that an announcement was made to the emergency department. There's been an attack. We anticipate lots of victims. So if you don't need to be here, please stand up and walk away. And immediately the entire emergency department vacated. People stood up and walked away. Anyway, it's very protocolized in terms of anticipating X number of people. And should you ever get that many people to come through the door, for instance, if a bus were to crash and you get 18 people all at once, it's very different than the way you currently walk into the emergency department. Right now, it's very orderly. You walk in, you give your name, rank, and serial number. What are you there for? They'll take a blood pressure. They'll ask a bunch of questions. So if there's a mass casualty incident, it's basically going from person to person and in about 2 minutes deciding, is this person going to die? Is this person savable? Or is this person kind of walking wounded, meaning you can have them walk over to another room and wait? And it's very hard because, you got somebody with multiple gunshot wounds to the face, to the head, to the chest. I can tell you right away, they're going to die. They may not be dead yet, but they're going to die. And you basically have to black tag them and say, okay, I got to move to the next one because I can save 5 other people instead of working on this person for, 2 hours and I know they're going to die. Wow. And that's a sad reality that many of you guys don't know, but it's kind of some decisions you have to make in the moment.
There's an interesting thing out there. You can probably YouTube it, which is a very good YouTube. It's where just YouTube or search gunshot wound through gel.
Oh, ballistic gel.
They made gels and they would do super fast slow motion and they would have like a 22 caliber going through and the cavitation was just, it just expanded a little bit. Whereas they used an M16 or an AK-47 round and the cavitation was huge because the energy, the speed of the round, and the mass of it made a huge cavitation. And that cavitation is actually local injury. And so that can be they are usually a lot more dangerous and cause a lot more problems and lead to higher morbidity and mortality. I think that was the first question. Are there anything else about that?
That was super thorough. Yeah, absolutely.
That was perfect.
So do you think that your hands-on experience as a physician affects your personal opinion on firearm violence compared maybe to someone more removed from direct treatment?
I don't know that. I do know that I've seen horrific injuries from gunshot wounds, blast injuries, motor vehicle accidents. I have what's called an availability bias, where I see a lot of them because we're treating them, and so I can't help thinking about, hey, how can we prevent this? Is there a way that we can prevent these injuries? And so, there are efforts that are put forth to try to do that. And a big thing is the automobile industry, for example. Huge successes in decreasing injuries with seatbelts, airbags, and anti-lock brakes and things like that. I mean, there's so many safety features now in cars that it's really remarkable how that's happened. Those are the kinds of things that, and of course, legislation, which is a big controversy in America right now as far as guns go. And so I think that's, did I answer all that? I think,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
And then do you think putting resources towards prevention of gun violence like this would be a better approach than just kind of repairing afterwards in hospitals and emergency departments?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, there's so much mixing of logic and laws with politics, and anything that would cause people just to stop for just a moment to worry about gun safety, gun laws. What's wrong with doing a background check on someone? Do you want to really release a gun to someone with mental health issues? Is it so much to ask that we, ask people to take a gun safety class? I mean, we do that for driver's licenses. We force you to.
Yeah.
We force you to have 40 hours or 50 hours of driving time. We put restrictions heavily on your licenses until you've shown that you are capable of driving safely. So I don't know why that logic isn't applied to gun usage and ownership. I mean, I like guns. I like firing guns. I grew up with them, and but they're dangerous. So yes, I think it is way more cost effective for prevention than to do what we do and end up on the back end, because these people, they may be salvageable, they may be fixable. I mean, but you will never ever be the same. And most people who've been shot wish they hadn't been shot.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. So
Yeah, just one. I think it's just one more. So, from a healthcare professional standpoint, does the easy accessibility to firearms increase their incidence? And if so, does that put a strain on our healthcare system?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing is to look at accessibility within the U.S. versus gun accessibility in Canada. So not nearly as many shootings in Canada, not nearly as many shooting deaths in Canada. So I do want to point out one thing. So most statistics you see have to do with deaths due to guns. But I can tell you personally, there's probably 5 or 6 more people who've been shot than who have been killed by guns. Because again, if it doesn't hit something critical, and it goes through you, we can patch you up pretty good. So, the numbers that you read about gun deaths is probably multiply that by maybe even tenfold greater number of people who've actually been shot.
Wow.
Because we'll save most people. Unless it's a gunshot wound to the chest or gunshot wound to the head, we're probably going to save you. And so I think the numbers are drastically underreported in terms of that. And I've been here in Bellingham for, I guess, 15 years. And, we've seen more gunshot violence over the trajectory. The trend is definitely an upward trend.
Mm-hmm.
There's one more thing about that one question about this question about with my exposure to the injuries or the injured people. The other thing that's important to know or to think about are those people who have been affected by the families or the patients who have been affected by these injuries, and because to them it's 100%. They have a loved one or they themselves were affected by these injuries. And so those are the people that really need a big voice in this, this conversation. Me, it doesn't matter how they get hurt. I try to help them, and my opinion is I think it's important. I think the data and analysis is important to get out to people as to what's happening and what we can do about it, and how do we make the system better. But I think it's really an all hands on deck type of thing, especially listen to the people who are most affected.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure you and your colleagues or your classmates are thinking twice about this when this event has happened, even though it was a hoax. I mean, it's, hey, well, geez, this can happen, and it can happen anywhere.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And to know and to do what you're doing is really important, and I applaud that.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot. Honestly, I think that's all of the points we wanted to hit.
Yeah.
You were incredible.
Thank you for everything.
Yeah,
Seriously.
We really appreciate you making time for us.
Yeah,
this is really cool.
Really
And
appreciate
you're
it.
obviously so qualified. And
Well, thank you.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
I was
yeah,
awesome.
you're welcome. Sorry I was late.
Oh,
No,
worries.
Don't worry
worries,
about
no
it.
worries
It's
at
all good. It's
Yeah,
all good.
we were looking at the same exact
We
thing.
were, yep.
All right.
Well, have a good evening and good luck.
Yeah, you
Thank
too.
you
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye.
Appreciate it. After speaking with doctors about the response in our healthcare system when an event like this takes place, we were curious what the response looked like from another perspective, that of law enforcement. So we spoke with a former sergeant in the Bellingham Police Department, Mark Stokes.
Oh, we can hear you.
Hello.
Hey, there you are. Okay, hold on. You got an old man on here, so now I can hear you, but I can't see any of you. But I guess that's okay.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, there I am. Hey, Hi, guys.
I see you. Can you see us?
I can see you guys. Yes.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Sweet to hear it.
Well, you
All
guys
right.
are all better looking than Jake. He's my
Oh man.
Wow.
You're dirty.
It's a great way to start it off.
Poor Jake.
You sure you're okay?
Okay.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you bet, you guys. And maybe he told you long before I was. I had a long career in law enforcement. Before that, I was actually a high school teacher and a football and wrestling coach. So
Oh, that's cool.
Whoa.
Really?
I love I love coaching kids and teaching. So this is it's an honor. So whatever you guys need, I'm glad to help.
That's
Oh,
awesome.
that is so cool.
Really appreciate it. I mean, I guess just to start with, can you just tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah.
Well, I was a Whatcom County kid, grew up here, and I went away to play football at Eastern Washington University, and then I played there for 2 years, and then came back and played. My brother actually is in the Hall of Fame at Western back in the old days
Really?
when Western had football, and he asked me to come home, and so I came back and played my last 2 years at Western. Graduated in education, wanted to teach and coach, and met my wife while I was in college. And I don't know what was wrong with our parents, but they let us get married while we were in college. And, I was coaching and teaching on a government contract out at Meridian Middle School and coaching at Meridian High School. And then after that Fuzz Bowl, because in those days things weren't quite as professional, they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you're 6'3" and 225 pounds. Why don't you become a deputy?" And I was like, "Well, I don't want to be a deputy. I want to be a high school teacher." And I'll never forget, they said, "You get $20,000 a year starting and a take-home car." And I went, "Okay, I want to be a deputy now." And 3 days later, I was in the police academy, and I didn't know anything about police work at all. And I truly believe, and I think Jake's heard me tell these stories a few times, that I think the best cops in the world are guys that never planned on being cops. I think they're more understanding and more caring. And so I did 5 years there, and then I did 32 years at Bellingham PD. So,
Wow.
and I got to do a bunch of fun things. I was on the SWAT team and worked undercover narcotics and a bunch of stuff. And then, then we moved, and then I remember Jake being born, and my brother being born, and had a good run. And I enjoyed it. I really did enjoy it. It was a good career. And then retired, and that was kind of it. So that's it in a nutshell.
All right.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Wow.
And then what was your title when you retired?
I was a sergeant. I worked. I had a bunch of different jobs, and that's what I liked about Bellingham, is you could do a bunch of different things. And I had been on the SWAT team, and then I became the sergeant of the SWAT team. Then I ended up being the traffic sergeant, which was really fun. It was really hard to pass those classes to ride those motorcycles. It's the state patrol. You have to go through their academy to do that. And that was fun. So I worked in traffic. I worked in narcotics. I worked on the SWAT team, and then I worked patrol, and then I retired as a patrol sergeant, because everything else you're only in there for 3 or 4 years at a time, and then you rotate out. And the thing about Bellingham, at least when I was there, was that we were part of the community. It wasn't like, I think you get a lot of, and I don't know how it is for you young men. It seems like it's kind of a us and them thing. And in those days, it was a we thing. It was, we were part of the community. I did the DARE program. So I coached at Fairhaven Middle School. I coached at Seaholm High School as an officer. So it was much more collective than I think things are today.
And then I don't know if it was communicated super clearly, but we're doing this project on like gun violence and gun control in the US right now.
Do you want me to tell you my philosophy on that, or
we have some questions, but feel free to give us info first. Or
well, I would say this. I think a lot of people believe that, and there are some, that cops are pro-gun, and I would say that's probably incorrect. We're the only civilized country in the world that allows people to walk into a store and buy a gun. You can't do that in Canada. You can't do that in Germany. You can't do that in Sweden. You can't do that in Russia or China or Japan. And it was, I think it was only 3 months ago where I was having this conversation with some of my friends that are retired, that it had become, I think it was CNN, I'm not sure, you guys might have to do a little background work, that it was now the #1 killer of kids from 0 to 17 was gun violence. So whatever we're doing is not working. And that's all I say when you hear about Sandy Hook or you hear about Texas and the first thing you hear is that, oh, don't take our guns away. Well, our children are dying from this stuff. So shouldn't we do something? I mean, shouldn't we do something? If they're dying. So that's my point, is that I don't have any answers. The older you get, the less answers you have, the more questions you have. But it's like, well, why is that? Why are we allowing that to happen? And so, and I don't know the answer. I don't know that anybody knows the answer. But we're not doing it right. Without question, we're not doing it right.
If we look here, what do you personally believe needs to happen to decrease gun violence locally and in the U.S.?
Well, I think, my brother, and he's a retired teacher. He travels all over the world, he and his wife, and he said the same thing one time. And I am certainly not a right-wing Republican by any stretch, but I'm kind of a independent, kind of middle of the road guy, where he's very much more liberal than I am. But every country he goes to, they ask him, why do you guys allow this? Why do you allow people to just go buy guns? Because no other country does. And having a gun or going out and shooting tin cans and at the gravel pit with your grandpa or something, that's fine. But I just don't think, I think we get so possessive of that Second Amendment or whatever it is that, we have the right to bear arms, and that, but it's not working. It's just not working. So again, I'm no different than you guys in that I just scratch my head and go, children are dying, and I don't care for that. So we need to be a little bit more honest about it instead of political. We need to say, hey, wait, we got to control this a little bit more than we're doing. And I don't know, and I get mad at the government a little bit when they say, well, the store owners have to do a better job. Well, some guy working in a gun store, he can't tell if you're mentally ill or you've got ill intentions, and you can't put that on him or her. So I think we have to have more rules. I really do. But again, if you want to go, hunt mallard ducks in the wintertime, I don't want to take that away from you. But I also don't think you should be able to go in and buy an assault rifle where it's illegal to even go into a garbage pit and shoot rats with the thing, because it's only that weapon only exists to kill human beings. It doesn't exist for any hunting purposes or anything. And so I scratch my head at why we fight so hard to keep that legal. It's, if you want to go buy a 22 or a 12 gauge or whatever, I'm not against that, but I don't understand, and they're fighting what is it now? The magazines, that, or you can only have a magazine that carries 10 rounds. Well, to me, that's fine. Well, no, we have magazines that carry 75 rounds or 50 rounds. It's like, well, who needs that? So now they do have I used to have a concealed weapons permit. I don't anymore. It expired, and I don't need one. But if I go in to buy a gun now, there's a 30-day waiting period, and they do a criminal background check. And I think that stuff's all good. That's a step in the right direction, and I have no problem with that. It's like, hey, I want to buy this, this 12 gauge. I want, you got to fill this paperwork out, and we need your license, and we need all this, and I think that's good. But we're one of the few states that does that. I think like Washington and Oregon and California do it. But you can be in Oklahoma and walk into that same gun store and walk out with a box of ammo and a gun. And so until we all get on the same page, and you guys could get in your car and drive to Oklahoma. It's like the three of you, like two of you are going to sleep and one's going to drive, and you can get there in 16 hours or whatever it is, and you'd go buy 3 shotguns and 300 rounds of 12 gauge ammunition and drive home, and it would be legal. So I until we all get on the same page about this, it's scary. To me, it's just scary.
What if you can speak on it? What's the Bellingham Police Department's protocol for responding to reports of an active threat inside a school? And have you ever gotten any of those calls?
Yeah, we trained hard for that after Sandy Hook. We trained super hard, and it's very scary. But and Bellingham is doing it correctly. We have a deputy chief there that was he took over for me, and he probably could be the head of any SWAT department in the United States. He's that good. His name is Don Ulmer. You go as fast and as hard as you can towards a threat. And that's where in Uvalde, they really, really made a mess of things because they waited and they sat in there. You have to go as quick as you can to the sound of gunfire. And whether you want to or not, you go. And usually, again, you will overpower that because most people that have a gun, there was that shooting down at the Skagit Mall. The same thing is when the cops ran at the guy, he didn't know what to do because he thought he was in charge with his little handgun. And the same thing at Texas where they made that mistake was you have to go as fast and as hard as you can towards the sound of gunfire because you're saving kids' lives.
Does increased access to guns, or the fact that that in America we have such easy access to guns and assault rifles, does that make a police force more scared potentially, or think of it as more serious to respond to a threat?
You're completely correct. Yes, it does. And they sell. I mean, I remember working, and I was just shocked. Of course, I was like anybody. Like I told you guys earlier, I didn't plan on being a police officer. So here I am. Okay, I think cops are good guys. My dad he worked at U.S. Customs, and he was a corpsman in the Korean War. So he'd been around. He was a nice fella, quiet guy. And then I saw these articles. In our day, you didn't see it on TV or on a cell phone. You read about stuff, and they were selling bullets that would go through ballistic vests. Now, why would you do that? In my mind, I was like, and it was all the major, it's like Winchester and Remington. And I'm like, what would behoove you to sell a round of ammunition that would go through a bulletproof vest? And they did because of Second Amendment rights. And I'm like, well, that's meant to do only one thing, and that's to kill cops. And so I would be like, what are we doing in our country? That was the first time, and I was a very young man when that happened. I was probably in my 30s, just a little older than you guys, but I was like, I don't get this. Again, the last thing I'll say, what we're doing isn't working. So, and like you, and you were smarter than I was when you were about 11 years old, helping me fix my boat. Is sometimes you have to look around and go, okay, if it's not working, what do I do? And then you listen to people that have a common sense attitude. So,
awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have a
so
nice
much.
night.
Thank you so
take
much.
care, man.
Good
All right.
night.
Bye-bye.
It's recording.
It's going,
So,
so
yeah.
I just need you to speak.
So it's clear after talking to Ms. Cole, as well as Dr. Rush and Dr. Everett, that we as a society are equipped to deal with gun violence with reactionary measures and protocols, both in our schools and in our hospitals, to deal with the effects of these tragedies. After they happen, the United States has decided to put forth lots of thought and effort to reducing their harm as much as possible. However, from what we've seen from all three of them, there are damages that cannot be healed afterwards, no matter how hard we try. The mental health effects, the physical injuries and death, the grief it brings to loved ones, and even the uneasiness of hearing a school bell after multiple shooting threats. On top of all that, Mr. Stokes added that lots of these fully and semi-automatic weapons with large capacity magazines are solely designed to kill humans. There's even special bullets that will pierce bulletproof vests. He also pointed out how in other countries, like Canada, their gun control measures are working effectively. Despite these obvious tragedies as a result of gun violence, the inherent dangerousness of firearms, and the effectiveness of gun regulation around the world in stopping gun violence, the United States still has done nothing. Despite how obvious the answer is to the gun violence epidemic in our country, lawmakers have done nothing. In fact, the few gun control regulations we have are actually being appealed around the country as we speak. Why? Why is it so hard for the American people and our own representatives in government to see what the answer is, to look through whatever biases they may have straight to the center of the death and horror that surrounds the topic of guns in America for a solution? After looking at a lot of news videos and articles,
we have a Second Amendment to protect the right to bear arms.
These are natural rights. They were very clear, our founding documents.
These men were arguing that's a violation of Second Amendment rights.
The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms.
Also a lot of social media posts, there really is only one answer. The Second Amendment, the constitutional right to self-defense. But wait, it doesn't actually say that in the Second Amendment. Do you just want to introduce yourself first? Like your name and what you are?
Okay, my name is Janelle Sutherland and I am a lawyer.
Nice. Let's go.
Not really practicing, but
qualified.
Qualified. I took the bar exam in February, so I just relearned a bunch of constitutional law stuff.
So you are up to date on
the Constitution.
I follow lawyers on Twitter, so I know I know what's happening in the Supreme Court.
So how has the purpose/interpretation of the Second Amendment changed over time, do you think?
So the Constitution, we have our rebellion against Britain. They write the Constitution because they want to create a federal government, give the government power rather than the states. But there is this group called the Anti-Federalists who are we don't want all the federal power because we want our state militias still. That's why it was an amendment, because the Federalists, they wrote the Constitution, and then they amended it and said, okay, you can keep your militias. So it says you have the right to keep and bear arms. Doesn't specify why. It doesn't say for self-defense. It doesn't say, you can own these many guns or whatever. So at the time, it just kind of was meant to refer to the militia. So then we go between 1876 and 1939. The Supreme Court, they had 4 cases come up where they could rule on individual gun ownership, and they didn't rule on it. They didn't say, yes, the Second Amendment is individual rights. They didn't say anything about that. So then we jump to 1981. The Republicans take control of the Senate. They haven't had it for 20 years or something. And so then they form a subcommittee to research the Second Amendment. And they're like, hey, we have proof that the Second Amendment was intended as an individual right to own guns. To own guns to protect himself, his family, and his freedoms. So again, those words are not in the Second Amendment. But they're like, oh, we have proof. That was the intent behind it. So then in 2000, the NRA helps elect the first George Bush. And he appoints a man named John Ashcroft as the Attorney General. So he gets this new policy for the Justice Department that says the original intent of the Second Amendment is to protect the right of individuals to keep and bear firearms. So just over time, they're like, the Second Amendment means this. It didn't start out that way. It doesn't have any of that language. But they're like, no, we've done the research and we've decided. So we're just going to convince the rest of the country. So then we get to 2008, a Supreme Court case called D.C. versus Heller. It's about gun law restrictions in Washington, D.C. The court ruled, so the Supreme Court, 9 justices on it, so they ruled 5-4, that the Second Amendment guarantees a right to own a weapon to protect hearth and home. So then we jump to February of 2016. Barack Obama is in office. There's an election in November. February 2016, Justice Antonin Scalia dies. He's the guy who wrote the opinion in Heller. Oh. Yeah, this gets to how much do you guys remember of this stuff? So he died, and he was a conservative justice, so Obama has a chance to replace him with a more liberal justice, which would flip the balance of the court 5-4 the other way. So he nominates Merrick Garland to be a Supreme Court justice, and what happened?
The McConnell put it off and put it off and put it off and said, we're not going to approve this guy because there's about to be a new president.
Exactly.
And so he wouldn't let them pass a new justice.
Yeah. He's like, oh, the people should be able to vote on who they want to,
right.
Which was not like a rule that had existed before.
It's not a rule at all, yeah.
But again, it's like, oh, I'm the head of the Senate, I can make my own rules. So yeah, they never held a hearing, and so they never put him in. So we have the 2016 election and Donald Trump wins. So he nominates Neil Gorsuch. And then we cut to 2018. Justice Kennedy retires. He was also in the Heller decision. He was one of those 5. There are, rumors that he retired because he's like, I'll retire if you appoint my hand-picked successor, Brett Kavanaugh, who had been one of his law clerks, who was also up through the Federalist Society. Then we jump to September of 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. And she was liberal justice. And this is about 6 weeks before an election. So what should happen? The last time it was like death in February, election in November. He's like, no, we can't hold any hearings. Mm-hmm. This is death in September, election November. Yeah, again, making up the rules. So yeah, they rush in Amy Coney Barrett.
Election.
Yeah, she was like, that was fast. And then like everybody got COVID at her nomination party. Little side note. So yeah, and all those 3 justices came up through the Federalist Society. So now we've got those 3 new justices, and then the other conservative judges. We've got John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, and they were all on the Heller decision. So we already know how they feel about the Second Amendment. So that brings us to June of this year. Case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Heard of it?
I read a little bit about it.
Because I told you to read about it.
You said something. Yeah, that's what I was. Okay, so yes.
Because I know later you're going to ask, like, how's the media coverage? And it's like, well, do you know about it?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. And also the Supreme Court, they were... they're like, oh, we're not going to take it slow. We're just going to do all the crazy stuff. So it kind of got overshadowed when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I think.
Yep.
So anyways, this was about a law in New York that was 110 years old. And basically it was about if a person wanted a permit to carry a gun, like to conceal carry, they needed to show they had an elevated need for self-defense. Like, I really need this for self-defense. So they just had an extra step to get a permit for concealed carry. And there was lawsuits like, no, that violates Second Amendment rights. So Clarence Thomas wrote the opinion. And so previous decisions were like, okay, a person has a right to self-defense to defend their home. This expanded it, like self-defense while you're out in the world. So he's got this new standard for evaluating gun control measures. So I don't know if you guys know much law stuff, but when there are like new legal theories, a court will put a test like, okay, here's this new thing that we're deciding, and we know it's new and complicated, so we're going to give you like, here's a test to follow so you know if it follows the rules. So Clarence Thomas puts this new test. He says, does a law interfere with the rights protected in the plain text of the Second Amendment, specifically the right to self-defense? Which is already a contradiction because he's like, is it in the plain text of the Second Amendment? Like self-defense? No. But he has this thing, there's a legal term called the penumbra, which is just like the hazy shape around the legal term, and you can say it means whatever you think it means. So he's like, I think it means this, and waves his hands. Okay, so he's like, if the law interferes with that right to self-defense, that law, we presume it's unconstitutional, just right off the bat. And then he's like, if you want to overrule it, the law can stay if it is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. So you're all very familiar with the historical traditions of firearm regulation. Like everybody knows all of that. And so, like, if you're at court and you're like, well, you know, these guns kill people, it's unsafe. It's like, that's irrelevant. The only thing that matters, you know, is like the protecting people. That's irrelevant. Why did you do this law? It doesn't matter. The only question is whether there is a historical analog from either 1791, when the Second Amendment was ratified, or you can jump all the way to 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, which applied the Second Amendment to the states. A little fuzzy thing there. But if you're like, okay, it only applies to muskets, no, because he said, this doesn't mean it only applies to weapons from 1791. He said, any modern instruments that facilitate armed self-defense are protected under the Constitution. His reasoning, he's like, the people already decided they have a right to bear arms because they ratified the Second Amendment. And so then he said there's no historical analog to New York's law. He's looking at New York's law that says you have to, you know, prove an elevated need for self-defense. And he's like, well, there's no historical analog for proving that. So this law is unconstitutional. He looked at historical gun regulations and he wrote, apart from a few late 19th century outlier jurisdictions, American governments simply have not broadly prohibited the public carry of commonly used firearms for personal defense. So he's like, historically, there haven't been gun laws. I saw some other articles, like Texas used to have the same laws that New York had. It's like, oh, that's an outlier. Like a bunch of Western states had strong rules. No, those are all outliers. By 1900, all of the largest cities in the country had like permit requirements or restrictions on concealed carry. But he's like, no, those are outliers. There was no gun regulation. So that was the Bruen decision in June.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there are a couple cases that have come up since then, not to the Supreme Court level, so like just at trial court levels or appellate levels. So I have, let's see, New York, before that came out, they were set to enact new laws about gun permits. They were going to require training. They wanted you to like disclose your social media identities, have interviews, and they were designating certain places as gun-free zones, like schools and parks and summer camps. They should be gun-free zones. That judge, he said that to prove a law is rooted in a historical tradition, he needs to see 3 analogous firearm laws from the 18th or 19th century.
Oh,
3.
Wow.
So he's making up a new rule. It's like, it can't just be one because that's not a tradition. That's just one thing. And you can't just have 2 laws because that's more of a trend. But you need 3 to show that it's a historical tradition. So should you have to disclose your social media accounts? No, because social media accounts didn't exist, so there are no historical analogs to. There's like nothing comparative to social media, so I was like, can't do that. Gun-free zones, he mentioned summer camps. Summer camps didn't exist back then.
Just like fully automatic rifles?
Yeah, but that's a gun. That's how he's using the test from the Bruen case. It's like, none of this existed historically, so we can't regulate any of that. There was another case about serial numbers on guns, because it's illegal to scratch out your serial numbers. Not anymore.
Oh,
what?
Because serial numbers didn't exist.
Oh, wow.
Oh my, cool. So given all of that, from a legal standpoint, do you think that the Second Amendment is a valid reason to oppose increased gun laws?
It's like all they have. And it started kind of with the NRA, like, hey, we're going to start floating this theory and we're just going to flood it until we get enough people with power who buy into this theory. And then it just, it goes on. So it's like right always call your representatives and say, hey, we support gun control.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, thank you.
Even though we are realizing the Second Amendment might not be as great of a defense as it's often chalked up to be, it's still here, and as a result. Here's that graph on a map. Notice the US is the only country in the world with more guns than people. Crazy. But how does that relate to the Second Amendment? Well, to start, here's a map of countries with a constitutional right to own a gun. Not the all-star list of countries in terms of gun violence to be associated with. Now here's the amount of gun violence in every country per 100,000 people. You can see that the countries with constitutional right to own a gun, the US is actually the lowest, and it may not even seem very high up in terms of the world. However, if you change this graph to only include economically advanced countries with a population over 10 million, it looks like this. Economically advanced here just means being among what the World Bank considers high-income countries. This means that if we cut down to only economically advanced countries with a constitutional right to own a gun, that graph looks like this. Not great.
You know, I'm always amused at those who come up to me and say, no other country has a constitutional right like this, as if to imply that there is something wrong with us. But we say, no other country has a constitutional right like this, not with scorn, but with pride.
But what about politics? We just like guns in our country more. It's not necessarily the Second Amendment. Well, we're not the only stage 4 country in the demographic transition model to have a large group of people who emphatically support gun ownership. In fact, almost all of the inland part of Australia has a strong traditional belief in the ownership of guns. However, in 1996, there was a mass shooting in Port Arthur that killed 35 people, and the conservative Australian government started a gun amnesty program, buying back over 1 million guns from the Australian population. There were even people at the time in Australia who surrendered their legally owned weapons as a show of solidarity with the movement. Since then, Australia has only had a single mass shooting. But what about bipartisan support? Australia, even though it had multiple political parties at the time, only had one government make this change. Well, after a 1996 school shooting in Britain where the shooter used a handgun to murder 18 people, shortly after the Conservative Party government banned most handguns in the country, except for a small and low caliber ones. However, in the next year, the Labour Party government that took power banned the remaining firearms, for real, bipartisan.
But what about mental health? Some argue it's not our gun control laws, it's the mental health epidemic in our country that we need to solve first. While we're not at all discounting the severity of the mental health crisis in our country, we just want to show that compared to others, it does not account for how much higher our gun violence rates are. Furthermore, what's easier? Increasing gun control universally, or battling an epidemic where the problem is unique to each person affected? A 2020 Commonwealth Fund study found that, compared to 10 other high-income countries, the US does have higher rates of anxiety and depression than other countries. However, I do want to add that of these countries, the US was the most likely to have emotional distress caused by socioeconomic issues, such as crime and violence in the neighborhood, which was specifically a part of the questions people were asked for the survey. These issues could very well be caused by how much gun violence there is in the US compared to other countries. In other words, it's possible that our gun violence here in America is partially behind our mental health crisis, which then fuels our gun violence issues, and so on in a vicious cycle of abuse. Furthermore, according to a study done by the Secret Service between 2008 and 2017, grievances with individual groups of people were by far the most common motive of school shooters. 83% of attackers dealt with personal grievances, and 63% were against other students. However, if you look at a study conducted in 2006 analyzing bullying rates across countries, you'll see that the US isn't exceptionally high on that list, and even below other high-income countries like Canada and Germany. And if you compare that to a map of life satisfaction and happiness, the US is actually a lot happier than many European countries and countries with less gun violence. Another theorized cause of high gun violence rates in the US is the idea of the American family falling apart. What this argument generally boils down to is the idea that we have so many single mothers raising children in our country because all the fathers keep leaving or dying, and our kids therefore grow up in a broken household and are more likely to commit violence later in life. However, this argument is entirely rooted in speculation. If you actually look at the numbers surrounding gun violence, where kids are growing up in single-parent households, a different story is told. Having a high percentage of kids living with a single mother does not equate to high rates of gun violence. With all that said, out of all the things people attribute our incredibly high gun violence rates to, there genuinely is only one answer. Nothing else statistically and logically makes sense besides how quick and easy it is to purchase a firearm in the United States and what that leads to in terms of gun access. And the reason for that, the reason for our damagingly lax laws in a world where the evidence is so overwhelmingly clear, as we've learned, is our very own Second Amendment. Briefly, I'd like to add that a common misconception with this issue is that it's how many guns we have in circulation is the reason for our gun violence, but that's also not the case. But what if we compare the second map of gun violence to that of gun ownership? They don't quite line up. Essentially, there's more to it than countries with more people owning guns will have more gun violence. Then how can it be claimed the Second Amendment is the cause for why the US has so much gun violence? Well, the reason is, as Ms. Sutherland explained, the Second Amendment in American culture has done damage as an idea as well as a law. Interpretations of it have prevented many laws regulating the types of firearms one can own from being passed, and the Supreme Court appears to be considering ruling that all gun control legislation is unconstitutional as we speak. Meaning, the Second Amendment is the main thing behind our lack of firearms restrictions, one of the largest contributors to our high rates of gun violence. Compared to other countries, it becomes clear that this is a uniquely American issue.
After mass shootings around the globe, countries with no overarching law preventing weapons regulations have been willing and enthusiastic to institute laws and programs that limit access to firearms. And look at how well these changes have worked out for all these countries. As previously stated, Australia has had one single mass shooting in the 27 years since their restriction and buyback went into place, and the UK has had no school shootings since the legislation they passed after the Dublin shooting in 1996. Comparing this to the, yes, you're hearing me right, 611 mass shootings that happened in the United States in 2022 alone by November 25th, or the 690 total in 2021, leads us back to the primary point that gun violence is an issue that must be addressed in the United States, and that increased regulation of weapons would in fact decrease the unprecedented amount of gun violence in the United States. Compared with the rest of the world, the United States rate of gun death amongst youth are truly shattering. The US is the only Stage 4 country in the world where firearms are the leading cause of death among youth, and the only country where it even appears in the top 4. As Sergeant Sokes said to conclude his interview, what we're doing isn't working. These examples show so clearly that the programs and laws that regulate the ownership of guns just simply work to decrease gun violence. Sure, arguments exist that mental health and bullying are to blame, and while these are problems, the fact is that none of these terrible incidences would happen when the would-be perpetrators just don't have access to the weapons needed to carry them out. And we know this both because it is logical and because of the real-world examples where it has taken place. We are by no means calling for an all-out ban on guns in the United States. Solutions that are very effective can be less radical than that, and can be done in ways that don't cause inconvenience. The weapons used to carry out all the mass shootings we hear about in the news are fully and semi-automatic rifles. Just the minor step of eliminating only these most aggressive of weapons from the population would essentially take away the threat of any mass shooting event, as these are the only weapons capable of firing that quickly and relentlessly. All these statistics and stories lead us back to the point that increased regulation of weapons would decrease gun violence in the United States, and that it cannot be overstated the level to which gun violence is an issue that must be addressed. All of this fully solidifies our conclusion that increased gun control would definitively decrease gun violence in the US and is a necessary step in doing so.
The other thing is, you age, it's like, okay, it's your turn. Now it's your turn. You know, I was there once, and that my time has passed. So, you know, if anybody's going to change it, it's going to be your generation that does that.